My son and his wife thought I was just a frail old woman they could push around and steal from right under my own roof. They isolated me, controlled my every move, and even tricked me into signing away my entire $45 million fortune, all while smiling and pretending to care for me. But they underestimated me. They never imagined their own greed would become the weapon I used to deliver the most perfect public humiliation they could ever imagine. The scent of gardenias and roasted duck hung in the air, a classic Atlanta combination that used to mean joy. From my seat at the head of the dining table, I could see it all: the sunlight glinting off the baccarat crystal, the quiet efficiency of the catering staff, the smiling faces of the city's most influential people. My home, the one Robert and I built as a testament to our life's work, was performing its role beautifully. It was a stage, and on this day, the play was a heartwarming drama of family devotion. At the center of it all was my daughter-in-law, Sarah, a picture of grace as she moved between guests, ensuring every glass was full, every plate was perfect. Every so often, she would return to my side, placing a hand on my shoulder. To the room, it was a gesture of affection. To me, it was a reminder, a subtle pressure, a possessive claim. When it was time for me to mingle, her hand moved to my arm, her fingers finding the soft flesh above my elbow. Her grip was like a vice. The smile she gave me was bright, beautiful, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was a smile designed for public consumption, a piece of the elaborate costume she wore. I smiled back, playing my part as the frail but cherished matriarch. We were quite the pair, the two of us. After the last guest had departed, the performance ended and my real life began. The walls of our beautiful Buckhead home seemed to close in the grand rooms, becoming a luxurious prison. Sarah's concern for my declining health had become an all-consuming project. My world began to shrink one closed door at a time. First came the private nurse, a stoic woman named Ms. Albright, whose primary qualification seemed to be her unquestioning loyalty to Sarah. My old friends found their calls went unanswered, their visits politely postponed due to my need for rest. Then came the technology. A health monitoring system was installed, a sleek tablet by my bed and discrete sensors in every room. Sarah explained it was to track my heart rate and movement to keep me safe. But I saw the small, unblinking red light on the camera in the corner of my ceiling and knew it wasn't my safety she was monitoring, but my compliance. The final piece was the new home gym. My physical therapy was a daily ritual of humiliation. Sarah would stand with her arms crossed, her voice a sharp prod as I was forced onto the treadmill. There were little shoves she called balance checks and rough grips to correct my posture. One afternoon, the treadmill's speed suddenly lurched forward. I stumbled, falling hard. As Sarah and the nurse helped me up, their concern was loud and theatrical. But for a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of satisfaction in Sarah's eyes. The culmination of their campaign came on a Tuesday. They sat me down in the library, my son David on one side, Sarah on the other. They presented a mountain of paperwork, a fortress of legal documents. They told me it was just a routine annual update for the trust, something to make management more efficient as I got older. The words they used were like weapons: fiduciary liquidity asset allocation, designed to confuse and overwhelm. David, my own son, couldn't look at me. He just stared at a spot on the Persian rug, his face pale. Sarah's voice, however, was smooth and confident, a relentless flow of condescending explanations. She pushed a pen into my hand. I let my own hand tremble, a performance of frailty for their benefit. My heart was a cold, hard stone in my chest as I signed away $45 million and a lifetime of work. I signed away my legacy, my independence, my very name. That night, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I waited until I heard the distant click of their bedroom door closing. Then I retrieved the small audio recorder from its hiding place inside an old, hollowed-out copy of Gone with the Wind. It had been Robert's last gift to me. He was a man who believed in trust, but he also believed in verification. My hands were steady as I slipped into the dark library and placed the tiny device behind a row of leather-bound books directly beneath the vent that carried sound from the study below. I didn't have to wait long. Their voices, hushed but sharp with tension, drifted up from the study. It was Sarah's voice that cut through the silence, a venomous hiss I had never heard before. She spoke of a bridge loan, a coastal development, a deal that had collapsed. She was frantic. She said the note was due in 60 days. I heard her spit the words at David, words filled with a lifetime of resentment. If they didn't start liquidating my assets immediately, they would be ruined. And then came the phrase that chilled me to the bone, the key that unlocked everything. She would not be humiliated again, she hissed. Her father's failure would look like a rounding error compared to this. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about greed. It was about a deep, festering wound from her past, a desperate pathological fear of failure. I finally understood the terror that was fueling her cruelty, and I knew my fight for survival had just begun. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. Knowledge is a heavy thing. After a sleepless night spent listening to the echo of Sarah's words in my mind, I came down to breakfast feeling the full weight of what I knew. I made sure to let that weight show. My shoulders stooped, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for my teacup. Sarah was practically glowing with triumph, a stark contrast to my son David, who just pushed his eggs around his plate. They thought they had won. They thought I was a ghost already. I waited for a lull in the quiet, then I cleared my throat, a fragile little sound. I mentioned an article I'd read online, something about a luxury coastal development that had run into some serious trouble with zoning permits. I looked at Sarah, my expression one of mild, dotty concern. "It sounded so terribly volatile," I said. Bless his heart, it reminded me of the sort of trouble her poor father got into. The words, wrapped in the softest southern drawl, hung in the air between us. It wasn't an accusation. It was a polite stiletto aimed with perfect precision at the heart of her deepest fear. The effect was immediate. There was a sharp clatter as Sarah's silver fork hit her china plate. Her face, for one unguarded second, was a mask of pure panic. She recovered quickly, of course, laughing. A laugh that was a little too loud, a little too sharp. She denied any knowledge of such a silly project, her voice brittle. Later that morning, David tried to smooth things over. He brought me a shawl, his hands fussing around my shoulders, and tried to explain their finances in a rambling, nonsensical way that completely contradicted the story Sarah had invented at the table. It was pathetic, really. But it confirmed everything. I had hit the nerve, and their panicked, amateurish response told me they were more fragile than they looked. Confined to my suite for the rest of the day, for my rest, I knew I couldn't wait. Time was a luxury I no longer had. My eyes landed on the health monitoring tablet sitting on my nightstand, its screen glowing with my vital signs. The very instrument of my imprisonment would have to become my key. My heart hammered against my ribs as I picked it up, my fingers scrolling past the health apps until I found it an old, pre-loaded bridge game. Robert and I had loved bridge, but this app served a second purpose, one we had arranged with our lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, years ago. A contingency plan for a situation just like this. Knowing Sarah was likely tracking every tap on the screen, I began to play. I played a sequence of specific, unusual hands, a game so illogical it could only be a signal. The message was simple, a silent scream sent out into the world. Activate Nightingale protocol. They must have sensed a shift, a change in the air. Or perhaps their panic simply needed a target. That evening, Sarah and David came into my room together. With practiced, sympathetic voices, they explained that my personal phone and laptop were causing me unnecessary stress. They were confiscating them for my own good. The next day, my physical therapy session was different. The pretense was gone. Ms. Albright's grip was harder, the pace on the treadmill faster. Sarah's voice colder. It wasn't therapy anymore. It was punishment. It was a warning. The gilded cage had lost its gilding. The doors were locked. The windows were barred, and I knew with a terrifying certainty that my time was running out. When you poke a hornet's nest, you have two choices: get stung or disappear. Since disappearing wasn't an option, I decided to play dead. The next physical therapy session was the perfect stage. Miss Albright was rougher than ever, and Sarah's voice was a whip cracking with impatience. This time, when the treadmill sped up, I didn't just stumble. I collapsed. I let my body go limp, my eyes fluttering shut, a faint, ragged breath escaping my lips. The ensuing panic was exactly what I'd hoped for. David was useless, stammering and pale. Even Sarah's composure cracked her frantic orders to the nurse, betraying a fear not of my condition, but of the consequences if I were to actually die on her watch. They carried me to my suite, and I let myself be a dead weight in their arms. I was disoriented, my words slurring, my gaze unfocused. For the next 2 days, I was the perfect patient, the perfect victim. I was utterly compliant, eating only when fed, speaking only in confused whispers. I saw the relief in their eyes. They believed my spirit was finally broken, that my earlier spark of defiance was just the last flicker of a dying ember. Their vigilance relaxed. Their arrogance, that fatal flaw I was counting on, returned with a vengeance. They thought they had finally won. As I lay in that bed feigning a stupor, I had a lot of time to think. I tried to understand the rot at the core of the woman who had taken over my home. Much later, after it was all over, Mr. Abernathy would help me piece together the full story. But even then, I could almost see it. I pictured her as a girl of 16, standing at the window of a grand Connecticut estate, a house much like this one. I could see her watching as her polished, perfect world came crashing down. Her father led away in handcuffs, while the neighbors, her supposed friends, peered from behind their curtains, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. I could feel the searing heat of that public humiliation, a shame so profound it would curdle a young soul. And I could hear the cold, silent vow she must have made to herself in that moment, that she would claw her way to a height of wealth and power, so unassailable that no one could ever touch her or make her feel that shame ever again. On the third day, convinced I was lost in a sedated haze, they left me alone for the afternoon. That was my chance. I moved with a speed that would have shocked them. From the shelf, I took down an old leather-bound copy of Persuasion. Tucked into a slit in the spine was a small, flat key. The key didn't go to a door, but to a lock hidden in the frame of Robert's portrait that hung over my fireplace. With a soft click, a small, fireproof safe was revealed. Inside was my arsenal. The original hard-copy trust documents, a second encrypted audio recorder, and my hope. I spread the thick pages of the trust on my bed. There it was, the clause Robert had insisted on, a provision I had once thought overly dramatic. The snapback clause. It stated that all control of the trust would revert to me immediately and irrevocably upon the presentation of an affidavit from an independent physician testifying to my being under duress or a victim of elder abuse. Robert had saved me one last time. My own arrogance was growing a cold confidence that mirrored Sarah's. I knew she was getting bolder, more careless. Before my collapse, I had managed to retrieve the first audio recorder and hide it again in the library in its old spot. That evening, I heard her on the phone through the vents. Her voice was smug, dripping with condescension as she spoke to the panicked lenders on the other end of the line. She was soothing them, reassuring them. There was nothing to worry about, she said. The old woman is completely incapacitated. We're filing the paperwork to begin liquidation next week. Her signature is already on everything we need. A chill went down my spine, but it was a thrill of victory. She had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed. She had just written her own ending. Waiting is the hardest part of any battle. For 4 days, I was a ghost in my own home, a silent observer in a wheelchair, my mind a whirlwind of strategy, while my body played the part of a broken vessel. Sarah was insufferably smug, treating me like a piece of furniture, while David just looked haunted. They were getting ready to make their move. But Robert and I had made our move years ago. On the 5th day, just as Sarah was discussing menus for a victory dinner party with the caterer, the doorbell rang. I heard Sarah's sigh of annoyance from my suite, the sound of her heels clicking impatiently on the marble floor. Then, a sudden sharp silence. The voice that carried up the stairs was not one she was expecting. It was calm, firm, and utterly unimpeachable. It was the voice of my lawyer, Mr. Abernathy. I could picture the scene perfectly, Sarah's mask of gracious hospitality slipping as she saw he wasn't alone. With him was a woman whose presence radiated competence and authority. This I knew was Dr. Lena Hale, one of the most respected geriatric specialists in the Southeast. Mr. Abernathy wasn't asking for permission, he was informing them. He was invoking a non-negotiable clause in the trust for an annual independent wellness review. They were trapped. To refuse would be an admission of guilt. To the world, they were my devoted caregivers. They had to let the fox into the henhouse. In the privacy of my bedroom, with the door firmly closed on Sarah and David's anxious hovering, the performance ended. The moment Dr. Hale's kind, intelligent eyes met mine, I felt the dam of my composure finally break. I didn't have to speak at first. I simply pushed up the sleeve of my silk robe and showed her the deep, mottled bruises that wrapped around my arms like grotesque bracelets. I showed her the matching ones on my ribs. Her professional calm hardened into a cold, controlled anger. I then handed her the small audio recorder. She listened through an earpiece, her expression growing grimmer with every word. Armed with the physical evidence of abuse and the audio of Sarah's own voice plotting financial coercion, they had what they needed. They confronted David first alone in the library. Mr. Abernathy later told me it was a sight to behold. Faced with irrefutable proof and the immediate, very real threat of criminal charges that would destroy his life and career forever. My son didn't hesitate. He crumbled. He wept and confessed to the entire scheme, the loan, the pressure, the forged signature, the abuse, pathetically trying to cast himself as a victim of his wife's ambition. Sarah must have heard his raised voice because she burst into the room just as his confession was ending. Her rage was a physical force, a volcanic eruption of contempt. But it wasn't directed at her accusers. It was all for David. I heard her scream at him not for what he had done, but for his weakness in getting caught. She called him a weak, pathetic fool. In that moment, their conspiracy, their marriage, and the entire rotten facade of their life together imploded in a firestorm of vicious, hateful accusations. That was my cue. I walked into the library not leaning on a cane or shuffling my feet, but standing tall, flanked by my doctor and my lawyer. The power in the room shifted instantly. Sarah and David stared at me as if they had truly seen a ghost. The frail, confused woman they had been tormenting for weeks was gone. In her place stood the woman who had co-founded a logistics empire, the woman who had signed their paychecks and paid for their home. My voice was calm and clear, cutting through the wreckage of their argument. I told them the Nightingale Protocol was now in full effect. The trust was frozen. I informed them that my security team was 5 minutes away and would escort them from the premises. They were to vacate my home within the hour. The final reckoning, I told them, would take place at Mr. Abernathy's office on Friday. Their reign of terror was over. They were left shattered and powerless, their own greed the architect of their ruin. The days between that Tuesday and Friday were the quietest I had ever known in my own home. The security team was professional and unobtrusive, but their presence was a shield, a silent affirmation that I was finally safe. I spent the time resting, but also preparing. When Friday came, I dressed not in the soft silks of a recluse, but in a tailored wool suit, the color of steel, a suit I hadn't worn since the last time I chaired a board meeting. The boardroom at Mr. Abernathy's firm was designed to project power. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Atlanta skyline, and a long, polished mahogany table reflected the grim faces of those assembled. This wasn't a courtroom, you see. I wasn't interested in that kind of justice. This was a tribunal of a different sort. Sarah and David arrived separately, their shared car and shared life, apparently a thing of the past. They looked haggard, diminished. They sat at the far end of the table, a chasm of polished wood between them. But they weren't the only guests I had invited. At my right sat Reverend Michael, the senior pastor of our church for 30 years, a man who had christened my son and presided over my husband's funeral. To my left sat Mr. Davenport, the stern, unflappable president of the bank that managed the Williams Trust. They were the pillars of the world Sarah so desperately wanted to conquer social honor and financial authority. With a quiet nod from me, Mr. Abernathy began. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. With chilling precision, he laid out the case, his words like surgical instruments. He placed a bound folder in the center of the table. It was Dr. Hale's certified medical report. He opened it to the photographs of my bruised arms and ribs, leaving them for all to see. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a sharp intake of breath from Reverend Michael. Then, Mr. Abernathy pressed a button on a small digital player. Sarah's voice filled the room, high and confident, dripping with smug satisfaction, as she boasted of my incapacitation, of the liquidation of how her signature was on everything she needed. I said nothing. I didn't have to. The judgment, the real punishment, came from the faces of my two guests. Reverend Michael looked at my son, and his expression was one of profound, soul-deep disappointment, a look far more devastating than any anger could ever be. Mr. Davenport's face was a mask of cold, professional fury. This wasn't just a family drama to him. It was an audacious attempt at fraud against his institution. In that moment, watching the horror and condemnation dawn on their faces, Sarah saw her life's ambition to achieve unimpeachable status in this city turn to ash. Their silent collective judgment was her true sentence. Only then did I speak. My voice was steady, calm, and final. I stated that I was invoking the snapback clause, effective immediately, reclaiming 100% control of all family assets. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, and told him he was disinherited permanently. Then I delivered the masterstroke. I announced that the entire $45 million Williams Trust was being dissolved. I saw a flicker of something in Sarah's eyes, shock, confusion, perhaps even a last desperate spark of hope that it would be liquidated after all. But then I explained its new purpose. The funds would be used to create and permanently endow a new charitable foundation. It would be called Safe Harbor Haven, and its mission would be to provide shelter, legal aid, and unwavering support for victims of elder abuse across the state of Georgia. My revenge wasn't to leave them penniless, it was to erase them. It was to take their ugly, greedy, criminal act and transform it into a public legacy of compassion, ensuring that the name Williams would forever be associated with protecting the vulnerable, a permanent shining monument to their failure. I left the boardroom that Friday with a sense of quiet finality, not triumph. The victory wasn't loud. It was the profound silence that followed a storm. Mr. Abernathy handled the aftermath with his usual tactical grace. A press release was issued, not detailing the ugly family drama, but celebrating the establishment of a major new philanthropic endeavor. The news of the Safe Harbor Haven Foundation, endowed with the entirety of the Williams Trust, spread like wildfire through the circles that mattered to Sarah. The story, as Atlanta's elite understood it, was one of my enlightened generosity. The subtext, however, was clear to everyone. The excommunication of Sarah and David from their social world was swift and total. It was a bloodless execution. Invitations to galas stopped arriving. Their country club membership was quietly revoked due to non-payment of dues. Friends they had known for years suddenly became unavailable for lunch. I heard their names mentioned in hushed, pitying tones, at the symphony the final nail in the coffin of their social relevance. The massive loan Sarah had taken out defaulted, of course, and the subsequent bankruptcy was a messy public affair that stripped them of everything they had acquired. They were ruined not by my hand, but by the collapse of the hollow world they had built. I learned of their separate fates through Mr. Abernathy. My son David, humbled and finally broken free from his wife's influence, divorced Sarah. He moved to a small town somewhere in North Georgia, taking a menial job and I hope beginning the long, quiet work of atonement. There is a sadness in me for him that will never fully leave the grief for a son I lost, long before I disinherited him. Sarah, on the other hand, was incapable of accepting blame. She remained bitter defiant and consumed by a rage that had no target left but herself. She vanished from Atlanta swallowed whole by the very public humiliation she had engineered. She had spent her entire life running from her father's shadow, only to find herself lost in a darkness entirely of her own making. 6 months later, I stood at a podium under a bright Georgia sun. The air smelled of fresh dirt and possibility. I was at the groundbreaking ceremony for the first Safe Harbor Haven facility. I was surrounded by reporters, by the mayor, by community leaders who spoke of my courage and vision. I looked out at the crowd and saw not the faces of my old social set, but the faces of social workers, advocates, and volunteers. I was no longer Eleanor Williams, the wealthy widow. I had been transformed from a victim into an advocate. My honor and my standing in the community were no longer tied to my fortune, but to my purpose. The seasons turned. The building rose and the gardens grew. And now I spend most of my afternoons here in this serene, sunlit garden at the heart of the Haven. It's a place of peace. Earlier today, a new resident arrived, a woman with fear still etched around her eyes, her hands trembling slightly as she held her teacup. I sat with her on this very bench, and I took her hand in mine. It felt frail, but there was a flicker of strength deep within it. I told her that she was safe now, that this is a place to heal, and in that moment I knew I had honored Robert's memory. I had redeemed my family name not by hoarding our wealth, but by turning an act of profound betrayal into a sanctuary. My victory wasn't in the ruin of my enemies, but in the quiet peace of this garden, a peace I had fought for and finally truly found. In the end, the story wasn't just about a family's betrayal, but about the nature of a true legacy. Some people, like Sarah, spend their lives chasing a legacy built on the brittle foundation of wealth and appearances, only to watch it shatter at the first tremor. But Eleanor, when her own world was threatened, discovered a deeper truth. She learned that real strength isn't about holding on to power, but about transforming pain into purpose. Her creation of the Haven showed that the most enduring legacies are not built from what we keep, but from what we give.